Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. And it's time to see what's making the headlines with the columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards and the Economist senior editor Anne McElvoy. And they're going to be with us right through to midnight for our extended news review. So welcome to both of you. Hope you're feeling energetic this long night ahead. We'll be talking to you in just a moment. First, let's take a look then at what's making the front pages. And the Metro, first of all, leads with the news that no COVID deaths were recorded today. That's the first time since March of last year. The Daily Mail suggests that that news means that people have nothing to fear from freedom. The Daily Telegraph reports that Boris Johnson is being pressured to delay the planned reopening on June the 21st, following the Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon's decision to slow the unlocking process north of the border. While the Times argues the figures mean there is fresh hope for the lifting of restrictions on June the 21st. The Guardian, meanwhile, leads with criticisms over the government's £1.4 billion plan to help students catch up on lost education as a result of the pandemic. So those are all the papers we've got so far. We'll, of course, show you the other front pages as they come in. But let's turn now to Steve Richards and Anne McElvoy. A proper hello to both of you to go through some of those front pages, first of all. And, Steve, we're going to kick off with the Metro, aren't we, which sums up what many of the papers so far are leading on. And this is the fact that today there wasn't, as they put it, a single COVID death recorded in the UK, certainly in the last 24 hours. I mean, that makes a lot of the headlines, doesn't it?
It does, and it's a very striking statistic, you know, that no one has died in this period, and we're not used to these statistics, which are optimistic, hopeful, etc. But I hope I'm wrong, but it all feels slightly too neat to me that as this so-called Indian variant spreads, there is this kind of unqualified optimism. I still think there needs to be some caution, but you can see the pressure on Boris Johnson to be not cautious in the headlines tomorrow. And fair enough, you know, we've had miserable evenings reviewing front pages. That's a good statistic. But underneath that statistic, there is still quite a few concerns. And it is interesting, as you said in your intro, that Nicola Sturgeon is already exerting caution in the immediate future in the light of this variant. So, yeah, great. This is a good statistic to celebrate. But I kind of think there are underlying things that we need to watch as well.
And what do you make of it? I mean, Nicola Sturgeon is pictured there on the front of the Metro, isn't she? Because she's announced today that there'll be a slowing of the easing of restrictions in Scotland. I mean, how much does that put pressure on Boris Johnson as he makes his decision? He has to make his decision, I think, by the 14th of June about whether or not all those restrictions are lifted as planned on the 21st. I mean, there are lots of different conflicting pressures on him, aren't there?
There are, and to be fair on the government's position, it would seem that there is enough evidence, certainly from the new cases that are coming through now at quite some speed of the Indian variants. Of course, the papers were going largely with that good news of no COVID deaths in a day, which is fantastic news. But that is still a long way from saying that you're out of the woods, because you have a lot of much younger people being infected with the Indian variant than were classically being infected before. That's also partly good news, because those of us who, shall we say, are no longer 21, although we may or may not look it on camera, have probably had our second jabs. And the more people have their second jabs, obviously the better the protection. But I wouldn't completely underplay the pressure on the Prime Minister. It isn't just a sort of gung-ho, right-of-centre newspapers and backbenchers. Businesses are desperate for a reopening, or at least, shall we say, to get as few restrictions in place as possible. UK hospitality is in a dreadful state, and with that goes livelihoods, goes jobs, and it gets harder and harder to recover the more of these lockdowns we've had, which have been successive. So there is real pressure on the Prime Minister. I know that in the last week we heard an excoriating account from Dominic Cummings saying the Prime Minister was being too lackadaisical, if you like, in putting lives at risk. But we mustn't forget that there is a very high cost to be counted too if this keeps being delayed. So I think this is an invidious position he's in. And yes, as you're right about Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon has gone with a more cautious line. Let's see if the Prime Minister is forced to follow.
Well, yes, and if we pick up The Guardian's coverage of this, Steve, they don't make it their main story, but the second story, first day without virus deaths in 10 months. But they say in their copy here, government sources have suggested that Boris Johnson was still minded to lift those final social distancing restrictions on June the 24th. I mean, do you think it's right that he will be very aware, not just the backbenchers, I think we'll come on to that in a moment, but also those businesses who are desperate to get up and running again, and some of them can only do that properly if restrictions are lifted. And also those people who will say, so many people have been vaccinated, what's the point of people being vaccinated if you can't lift restrictions? Steve, you look like you've frozen. I don't know if you can still hear me. No, I think we have lost Steve's line there. We'll try and reconnect with that. But Anne, perhaps you could pick up on that for me. I mean, obviously there are those different pressures, businesses, but also people saying, what was vaccination for?
Yes, that is true. And I think that the problem that the government, if you like, sort of set itself, although I have some sympathy with the position that there are trade-offs. Whenever you choose to do it or not do it, there are trade-offs that really matter to people's lives and opportunities and well-being. But there is, I think, a problem, and Boris Johnson has fallen into this before, is creating expectation around a date. So it's the date, not data argument. And as the data moves, if it does continue to move against a reopening, a full reopening on the 21st, then he will stand accused. And last week was, I think, the first bite at the cherry that we saw from Dominic Cummings, but there will be more criticism from those who said you are not really doing what you said you would do, which was make the policy according to the data you have available. You've got yourself stuck with a date and you don't want to back off it. Certainly there will be people saying, well, I've had all my vaccinations, I've had one, I've had two, you know, I'm a bit covered, or I'm actually almost as near damn it fully covered. Now you tell me I have to stay at home again, or you go down the vaccine passport route. But the government's made pretty clear, I think, having road tested that voters don't really like the idea of a kind of two or multi-tier society in which I can go out, but my younger relatives can't. And I think that would land very badly. So, you know, he may have backed himself into quite a corner with this date for the 21st of June, or he may be lucky and the variant subsides. We don't know yet.
Well, yes, and Anne, I'm pleased to tell you that we are rejoined by Steve. There he is, animated once again. Good to see you back.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
No. These things happen. We're all so used to it now, aren't we, in the age of Zoom interviews and conversations, so don't worry at all. We're going to move on to the Daily Telegraph, Steve, because included in their lead article is that reflecting the fact that a number of backbenchers are also putting pressure on Boris Johnson. How much is he likely to listen to them?
Well, according to Dominic Cummings and others, a great deal. But this is the problem. And Anne, sorry, I don't know if you heard me say before I was rudely cut off, Anne brilliantly highlighted the dilemmas of leadership in this. It is a real invidious position. But yeah, sure, Tory MPs say, come on, June the 21st, let's open everything up. And others will as well, a lot of the newspapers, and there is an economic case for doing so. But if the data suggests that this is risky, it will prove counterproductive. We've been through this so many times. I hope his libertarian instincts, Johnson's, is countered by a very careful review of the data. If the data says go for it, great. If not, I hope he's cautious. But Cummings, in that compelling 7-hour testimony, which I watched, I'm sure Anne watched, suggests that might not be the case, and that's dangerous for the country.
And Steve, now that we've got you back, I'm going to make most of you. Do you think it's possible that the decision could be a bit of a fudge, if you like? You could say, well, we're going to loosen these restrictions, but there are a few things that we're going to hold back for the time being. So people get a bit of a mixed bag. They get a sense that they're getting a bit more freedom, if not the whole thing.
Well, it might be described as a fudge, but maybe that's quite sensible. I don't know. I think they will wait and see what the data is nearer the time, and it's going to be a very, very tough call. But that wouldn't be a fudge necessarily. Maybe that would be quite sensible to say more can open up, but not everything. And, sorry to be hesitant and pessimistic, but I've done quite a lot of these newspaper reviews with you where we've talked about, oh, yeah, Christmas, we've got to go ahead. The autumn, yeah, got to open up. And all sorts of nightmares have followed from that. Now, hopefully with the vaccines, that's not the case this time. But I do think they've got to do a very careful review of that data in a 10 days time or whatever the final deadline is. And a fudge might be the most sensible response.
And Anne, it's interesting to see how the papers do play it. The Daily Mail is making clear very much their opinion on this, on their front page, aren't they? They're saying 0 deaths, nothing to fear from freedom. They're making it very clear where they stand. Do we get any sense, do you think, of what the public thinks?
Well, I think that the trouble is it rather depends how you put the question. So the Mail has always, I think, really been on this side of the balance sheet, and they only just about pulled back before Christmas. It was understood and they understood why Christmas had to be much more constrained. There is, I think, a desire among a lot of people to get back, to mingle, etc. The thing is, I don't totally understand is that a lot of readers are actually small C conservative readers, are often small C conservative about health risks as well. So I think sometimes it's not exactly that papers, there's a view that they really have an insight into the souls of their readers and they understand everything from their market research. But quite often this can just be views that an editor has, or they might feel that they want to be strong in the argument, even if there's evidence on both sides. So I'm not absolutely convinced as to why the Mail should be so strongly in favour of Freedom Day as it appears to be. Quite a lot of their readers, I think, are happy to accept the constraints. But I think what this gets to the heart of is, what do you think is a sensible interpretation of the data? And Steve's absolutely right. I'm also work for The Economist. We have data for breakfast, lunch and dinner. But we do have arguments about what data means. And we do have debates about, if you were going to open some things, not others, where would you stop? And some of the things that people maybe would think are not so dangerous might turn out to be so for certain groups of the population. So then you get into kind of local lockdowns, and people really didn't like those, did they? So I think to be sensible about the data, unless one's always going to go for the most stringent approach possible, in which case you should level with the public and say so, well, that's not really the way that Boris Johnson has conducted himself. And politically, you have to say, so far, he's hung on to his hat. He's got problems. There's nobody else touching him in the opinion polls.
Well, it's going to be a really interesting couple of weeks, isn't it, as that Boris Johnson gears up to making that decision. But we're going to take a pause right now. Lots more to talk about in just a moment, including, does the government's plan to help students catch up after the pandemic make the grade? We're going to be talking about that in just a moment. Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me tonight, Steve Richards and Anne McElvoy. Well, welcome back to both of you. The Guardian we're kicking off with this time, Anne, aren't we? COVID tuition catch-up plan dismissed as inadequate. So who is saying it's inadequate?
Well, this is really the plan to spend money, which actually looks like a reasonably good headline figure of money on catching up children who fall in behind or in danger of falling behind because of the gaps in their schooling in this rather erratic exam system. The trouble is that it's really a quite small amount of money when you kind of disaggregate it across the number of groups, but school, further education, etc., who would have a claim on it. I always feel it's a bit like this. Any thing to do with education spending is always a bit cheese-pared, and this is no exception. I do think, although The Guardian, sort of slightly true to form here, The Guardian goes on the fact that there's never enough money. There's just never enough money for everything that The Guardian would like it for. But in fairness, what they are pointing out, that we're lagging on having anything that we could really put into place. So in terms of what the quality and reliability and consistency of digital education and how you carry that through these very long summers. I mean, I have a daughter at home post sort of GCSEs, whatever they are this year, for 12 weeks. But, there are certainly a lot of children who are suffering much more where they're in homes where they can't continue to learn easily without support. And that is going to knock on in terms of a big social mobility problem, which I think will be laid at the government's door. So I think this isn't only the classic complaint about there's never enough money for anything to do with schools, though it is that. It's something that is going to have more serious consequences, and hence the front page billing.
Steve, do you think that's right?
Yeah, I think it's a massive challenge for the government to address the astonishing shortfall in education, unavoidable over the last year or 18 months. And it will need big thinking. And some of it will be money, I'm afraid. There's no getting away from it. And they need to think big about this. Now, the headline dismissed as inadequate. Inadequate's a vague word and term. But I do think it's going to involve some really big thinking to address this shortfall in the coming months.
And Dan, I'm just going to move this on very swiftly to a little article on the front of the Daily Telegraph about Wetherspoons. We've only got about 30 seconds, though. Are you able to it's a small article. I'm hoping you can sum it up in a brief amount of time.
So, yes, Wetherspoons boss Tim Marsham would like more generous visas, really, to get staff for pubs because so many people have left the hospitality sector, not just since Brexit. He's an ardent Brexiteer, which, as I suppose some people might find somewhat ironic here. But also he says, well, we need more staff anyway. The pandemic has also impacted us. 1 in 10 people roughly has left the hospitality sector. But he would like them according to British rules and not according to EU ones. So he's got a bit of a mix and match menu, but there is a serious lack, wherever you stand in the Brexit debate, there's a serious lack of staff in the hospitality and bar sector.
I think that was almost exactly 30 seconds. You're very obedient and efficient. Thank you very much indeed.